In our last episode, we saw the rise of the Dominion of New England, a super colony under Governor General Edmund Andros, which came to absorb the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Maine, and New Hampshire, which were on and off again possessions of the Massachusetts colony. Andros also absorbed the Plymouth Colony, Connecticut, Rhode Island, the New York Colony, and by extension Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, as well as the colonies of East and West New Jersey. Now, if you put all of that together and fast forward a few generations, the Dominion of New England consists of 6 of the 13 original colonies. A massive feat, one accomplished in less than 3 years. And who can we credit for the rise of the Dominion of New England? Well, first there was a man by the name of Edward Randolph, who was a relative of the Mason family, who began the New Hampshire colony, and Randolph was also a customs agent within the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a job that often came with personal lawsuits and death threats. Randolph's complaints and observations about the Massachusetts Bay Colony were well received by the Lords of Trade back in England, and they basically enabled him to design a new government structure for New England. Yes, it was Randolph who put into place much of the structure we're going to see in the Dominion of New England. He selected their first president and all of the counselors that would be vested with all executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The man he picked to be the first president and only president of the Dominion was a man named Joseph Dudley, who came from the Puritan elite of Massachusetts and was in England to negotiate a new charter. In the last episode, I called Dudley a Quisling, because instead of trying to find some middle ground or preserve the general court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he began colluding with the Lords of Trade and assumed his position as president of this new thing, the Dominion of New England. He went home and he dissolved the general court he was supposed to represent, and for the first time installed the Dominion. Never a temporary job, in December of 1686, Sir Edmund Andros arrived to displace Dudley as the Governor General. Dudley would remain on as a counselor. And then, as I mentioned, it is Andros who takes the Dominion from the northern reaches of Maine all the way down to the Delaware River. Now, if you haven't listened to previous episodes, you might be saying to yourself, well, who is this guy? Who is Edmund Andros? Well, he was born into a noble family. His father was a staunch royalist, and during the English Civil War, poor King Charles I loses his head. The royal family has to go into exile for their own safety, and many of their supporters went with them. That included the family of Edmund Andros. Now, Edmund was a few years younger than King Charles's children, the future King James II and King Charles II. But in this tight-knit circle of exiles, it's likely that Andros did in fact grow up around these future monarchs. As Edmund Andros grew, he would serve in various noble houses and fought in wars on the continent. And then in 1673, when the Duke of York, the future King James II, received back his colony of New York in the Treaty of Westminster from the Dutch, he made Edmund Andros the new governor of New York. In that position, Andros did everything in his power to make the colony as powerful as he could for the Duke and as profitable as he could, which included attempts to try to absorb West New Jersey, East New Jersey, and the Connecticut colonies. And in fact, in East New Jersey, after the Lord Carteret died, the proprietary owner of that colony, he invaded East New Jersey, imprisoned their governor, cousin to the Lord Carteret himself, and then assumed the governorship. An aggressive man who often had to be put back into his place by the Duke of York, the man he was himself supporting. Fast forward a few years, and Edmund Andros made the short list to become the first Governor General of this Dominion of New England. And when he finally nabbed the job, the Puritans in New England must have felt some sense of dread. Here was a guy who had tried to absorb the Puritan colony of Connecticut. Here was a guy that grew up around the Duke of York, who now was King James II upon the death of his brother. And Andros was a staunch Anglican. The Puritans of New England, having visibly split from the Church of England long ago, felt like the hardline Anglicans were essentially Catholic light, and they were often accused of being secret Catholics. Now, King James II himself was a publicly professed Catholic. Now, these religious matters, they don't really matter to most of us today, especially when we're talking about variations within a large umbrella of a religion, the different types of Christianity or Buddhism, etc. If it's under one of these umbrellas, we can assume there's some commonality there. The Puritans especially did not see things like that. Let's just keep that in the back of our minds. Now, within the Dominion, in the last episode, I spoke on all the various successes that Andros had. Of course, a massive expansion of the territory of the Dominion. He had subdued tax protesters. He ended the church tithes for the Puritan congregational churches of New England, allowed freedom of conscience, and built the first Anglican church in New England. But on the flip side, he had greatly raised taxes, and did so with no elected assembly. King James II himself made sure that the Dominion of New England would have all its power vested in this Governor General and his council. In other words, there would be taxation without representation, something that protesters in the Dominion rightfully pointed out violated their rights that they derived from the Magna Carta. Now, in one of these cases, Joseph Dudley, the former president serving as judge, said that the Magna Carta and the rights within do not follow you to the end of the earth. In other words, when you leave England, you leave those rights behind. You can see the cracks forming. So Edmund Andros raised taxes and created new taxes greater than they had ever been before, and yet that revenue still would not pay for his government and the 60 English regulars he had in the colony. An English regular in the Revolutionary period you might call a redcoat, a professional soldier who was not a mercenary nor a member of the militia. And so despite the protests, Andros was going to raise taxes even higher, which brings us straight into the year 1688, when he really begins his push to force the largest landowners in the Dominion to submit a title history to him of their properties so that he could reissue new deeds to them with the seal of the new Dominion government. Now, this sounds like a good thing, and Andros wanted to do this with all properties within the Dominion. He wanted one set of laws for the Dominion and one clear and non-conflicting archive of all of the properties within the Dominion. Now, how this ties in with generating revenue is that you would have to pay to have your property that you perhaps owned for generations and bought from Native Americans reconfirmed by the Dominion. And one secret thing that Andros did not let the public know is that with this new confirmation of the lands you owned would come a quit rent, which you could think of as a property tax, which originally would only apply to new undeveloped lands that would be sold in the Dominion. But now, Andros had it in mind that it would apply to everyone who owned land anywhere in the Dominion. And so while Andros had many great successes, he now had the tiger by the tail, because a few tax protesters in Massachusetts, a few influential landowners in Rhode Island, Native American troubles to the north, and troubles back home, which we'll talk about, late into the year 1688, they were starting to bubble up. To quote the historian Richard R. Johnson from his book Adjustment to Empire, "By the summer of 1688, the Dominion had become an alien regime, estranged from its subjects, bloated beyond manageable limits by successive annexations. It remained committed to a policy of centralization." Now, just to throw in my 2 cents here, Andros wanted to continue to consolidate everything, just as his benefactor King James II back in England and the Lords of Trade were trying to do empire-wide, rescinding city charters and charters for colonies outside of New England, places like Jamaica. They wanted to dial back all the powers they had delegated outward. Again, the term would be consolidation. Andros was a fan of this, but by this point, his council consisted of members from every colony with the exception of the 2 Jersey colonies, and these counselors did not like one another. Why? Because they were from competing colonies. These were all colonies that were growing outward, butting up against one another, fighting over land and issues of governance, the best ports, extracting tributes from Native American tribes. The English colonies traditionally were very much competitors with one another. And now Andros's counselors were at each other's throats. Yes, 2 generations or so before the American Revolution, when we wanted to throw off the British Empire and unite, we were fighting a governor general from England, no British Empire yet, to restore our previous condition of being disunited. separate. I think that'll do for a recap. Now for some new information. In the spring of 1688, a man by the name of Increase Mather, president of Harvard University, a prominent Puritan clergyman whose family had been part of the Puritan exodus a generation before, eluded the detection of Dominion agents and sailed to England with one specific mission: to curtail the power of Edmund Andros. And his mission will change over the course of this story, but initially, he wanted the Dominion to have a representative assembly. As all reasonable Englishmen had requested, that assembly would be responsible with raising through taxation £5,000 every year to fund the government. The Puritans, rather beaten down at this point, knew they weren't going to gain any ground on the issue of religious freedom, so they weren't going to try to claw back their tithe or control of the assembly. And lastly, Mather wanted to eliminate the quit rent. We will elect a government. That government will collect taxes that will pay for everything, including the governor. And all this business about an annual quit rent will be unnecessary. The Lords of Trade actually listened to Increase Mather, and when they forward their correspondence to King James II, they included all of his requests except for the ability to make a representative assembly, which at the end of the day was really the larger problem of the Dominion, the lack of an assembly to make up the legislative branch. Now, the story of King James II unravels very quickly. In his attempt to consolidate the empire and create revenue streams for himself outside of Parliament, the body of government that cut off his father's head, he had rescinded charters, both corporate and colonial, and for city municipalities. He had sold licenses, basically enabling monopolies for goods flowing in and out of the country. And if you know even a little economic theory, you could see why this would cause a downturn in the economy. So much so that by October of 1688, James II has to abandon this policy of cancellation and reevaluation and monopolization, and he proclaims the restoration of charters. He makes no mention of colonial charters, but Increase Mather in his letters, going back to New England, assumes that the Massachusetts Bay Charter will be renewed. The Attorney General of England himself informs the Lords of Trade that the Massachusetts Bay Charter had actually been illegally nullified. The Lords of Trade then agreed to create a new charter and review the powers they had given to Edmund Andros. Another reason for the sudden turn in policy from King James II, his own son-in-law, Prince William of Orange, invites the inhabitants of the English Empire to rise up against the tyranny of King James II. And this wasn't a selfless gesture. William III of Orange intended for his wife and himself to become the new monarchs of England as king and queen. You see, King James II just had a child, a son, who according to the succession laws of the day would become the monarch before his older sister. That child, whose mother was Queen Mary, an ultra-Catholic Italian princess, would likely also be Catholic. But King James II's daughter, also named Mary, married to Prince William, himself a nephew to James II. I know it's confusing. Well, this power couple, they were Protestant. Again, in a time when this stuff really mattered. So coupled with the economic policies of James II and his religious denomination, Prince William, Prince of Orange, the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, felt he had a strong enough hand to push out his own father-in-law and uncle so that he himself could become the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But now with these events in mind, we turn back to the other side of the Atlantic, because the Governor General, Sir Edmund Andros, and everybody else in North America would be receiving the news of developments and threats between continental Europe and the British Isles on a delay. And in the many accounts that I've read, a transatlantic voyage at this time, if it took 2 weeks, that was extremely fast. Even 3 weeks would be something to brag about. 6 weeks could be fairly normal. And so Prince Philip's declaration at the end of September, in and of itself nothing definitive, by the closing days of 1688, were only trickling into New England as whispers and rumor. Nothing more than talk and speculation. But Increase Mather in his letters back to England, in the most explicit way he could, would express that, hypothetically, if William and Mary were to invade Britain and dethrone their own father and father-in-law and uncle, James II, similar developments could occur in New England concerning the Dominion, as long as those involved could quite clearly align their interests with those of the new monarchs. Now, in plain English, if we're going to get rid of Andros, we have to do it around the same time that William would supplant James II. And we have to do so in a manner that would suggest that we were overthrowing a representative of James II in support of the new king and queen. This is the plot that the Puritans, especially in the former Massachusetts colony, would be mulling over throughout the cold winter of 1688. And again, they don't express this explicitly, but it comes out in the letters a little bit, especially if you look at the correspondence between Increase Mather and his son. And then if you take into account what happens at the end of our story, it's very clear some coordination was involved. Maybe I'm reading into it too much. You'll be able to judge me by the end of this story. Andros, for his part, heard these rumors, but on his end, there really wasn't anything he could do as a colonial governor to influence a family feud spanning nations on the other side of the Atlantic. Probably more pressing for him, especially in December of 1688, is the arrival of his wife. He had been without her since the end of 1686. It had been 2 years where he made for her a wonderful Anglican church, got himself a townhome, grew the Dominion, and tried to make it profitable enough to support its own government. Sometime in mid-1688, he decided that he was close enough to all of these goals that the Dominion would be fit for his wife's presence. He sends for her. She arrives in late 1688, and in January of 1689, she dies. But Andros would not have very long to mourn. A number of the local natives in the Connecticut colony were slaughtered by French allied natives to the north. Andros rushed there to support them, reassure them, and promised to reach out to the governor of Canada to prevent this from ever happening again. Which brings us to similar events on the Maine frontier, where in the spring of 1688, a French trading post was ransacked by English marauders from the New York colony. These Frenchmen then inflamed the Abenaki to attack the English frontier, exacting revenge not on New Yorkers, but those living in northern New England. In one specific incident at the settlement of Saco, Captain Blackman of the militia seized 20 natives suspected to have taken part in one of these atrocities, 20 being quite a large number for this place and time. The natives became quite alarmed and began kidnapping Englishmen in order to arrange an exchange. The timing of that exchange was bumbled, which led to a skirmish where several natives died. Andros, not yet in Maine, chastised the local militia captain and demanded the immediate release of the 20 native captives. If you listen to our last episode on the rise of the Dominion, or our episode on King Philip's War, you'll know that Sir Edmund Andros, in almost every single way, was superior at dealing with Native Americans than your average Puritan New Englander in a leadership position. This case would be no exception. Councillor Dudley at Boston, while Andros was en route, decided to send 40 men and a sloop north to defend the Maine frontier. They were to tell the local militias up the coast to run a horse patrol as often as they could and kill any Native Americans they did not recognize and who would not willingly submit to be detained. Not a policy Andros would have approved of. Andros in Boston receives the news that the towns of Newton and New Dartmouth had been burned to the ground by the natives. And in what seemed to have been a spiraling situation that we can't lay very much blame on Andros for, Andros knew he now had to become more assertive in his approach. Along with his regulars, he raised a force of 400 to 500 men from the local militias. He originally wanted Waite Winthrop to lead the force to the north. However, Major General Winthrop was ill, and Andros himself decided to lead the army to the frontier. Some historians speculate that with all of the rumors going on concerning events across the Atlantic, Andros simply wanted to get the men of military age out of their communities during the long winter. But by leading this force himself and taking his regulars with him, or at least most of them, he left Boston in the control of his counselors, including many who were part of the old Puritan Guard, who could now have discussions with one another quite openly. On January 10th, 1689, another letter arrived from Increase Mather. This one, as mentioned before, specifically told the people of Massachusetts that the Attorney General of England had declared the Massachusetts Charter illegally annulled. And Increase wrote, in quotes, to prepare the minds of the people for a change. Yes, whether it be King James II or William and Mary, it seemed that Andros's regime was in great danger. And while on the main frontier, having brought far too many people with him, only to find far too little action, he certainly began to hear these rumors himself, because in March of 1689, he resolves to quickly return to Boston, the seat of power, as fast as he possibly could. He leaves the militiamen under the command of his regulars and begins his trip back to Boston. In an interesting and heated exchange while in Salem, at one point he asked the local Reverend Higginson, whether all the lands in New England were not the king's. The Reverend responded, no, for two reasons. God gave earth to the men who would use it, and that New Englanders had bought the land directly from the natives. Andros disagreed, claiming that land could only be bought from the natives by those who already fell under a charter issued by the king, and with these old charters revoked, all the undeveloped land reverted to the king. This is the last civil argument we're going to see in the story of Edmund Andros. And it's this difference in philosophy which develops into a very real issue of land ownership and whether someone can be taxed on that land that sent increased Mather to England in the first place. Then in April of 1689, a man by the name of John Winslow, visiting Boston from the Virginia colony, and perhaps a relative of the Winslows from the Plymouth colony, told the people of Boston that King James II had been overthrown by William and Mary. Again, as much as many of us don't trust the news today, imagine getting your news on a delay of months or several weeks and only receiving it through a sailor. You wouldn't know what to believe. And the people of Boston noted that Andros did not declare a public celebration for the new monarchs, William and Mary. Meanwhile, just based on this rumor alone, many New Englanders, especially the Puritans, were ready to throw their allegiance behind these new monarchs, even without getting official word that they had won some very quick and bloodless revolution, which seemed unlikely. And then the homegrown rumors began to spread. King James II very famously had ties to the French Empire. During the English Civil Wars, the various branches of the royal family and their supporters sought refuge in France and other parts of Europe, but usually through first fleeing to France. The rumor spread that if James II had indeed been dethroned by his own son-in-law, he would then flee to France. And from France, James II would call upon his loyal Governor General Sir Edmund Andros to turn over New England to the French. This is an absurd conspiracy. New England having over 50,000 people, New France nowhere near that number. It would be a very expensive effort, both in manpower and money, to annex New England to the French Empire. But conspiracies don't have to make sense, do they? And they can still affect history when people dictate their actions by them. For Andros's part, and why this might even remotely seem possible, the historian Cormac O'Brien says of Andros,
his sense of duty compelled him to stand fast at the side of James II, a Catholic monarch whose designs on bringing all England back into the papal fold were as offensive to Andros's Anglicanism as they were to Mather's Puritanism.
And this is the reality of the situation. Andros was not the puppet master nor the puppet in some great popish plot, but instead he adheres to an older, chivalrous sense of loyalty between a greater noble and a lesser noble. But for the average New Englander on the ground, we can't expect them to differentiate the motives. And Andros perhaps made things worse because he tried very hard to stop the spread of this information, this rumor of the ascension of William and Mary. He moved to arrest John Winslow for spreading false information. And closing in on the middle of April of 1689, the historian J.H. Eliot writes that Andros's
arrogant, arbitrary, and secretive character had alienated even his natural supporters.
Likewise, the lieutenant governor of the Dominion of New England, Governor Nicholson, effectively managed the New York colony and the two New Jersey colonies, made the same moves to keep the news that William had landed in England from circulating in the New York colony, which before being New York was a place called New Netherland, and still had a very large Dutch population, who would be very happy to hear that the Prince of Orange, a Dutch nobleman, had taken over England. But again, while many hoped that he had, the people of the New World did not know that yet, which makes what's going to happen next extremely dangerous. While Sir Edmund Andros was in Boston, trying to stay on top of these rumors and locate the center of what he suspected to be the beginnings of an organized uprising, the militiamen on the main frontier mutiny against the regular officers that were supposed to command them, deserted their posts, and began marching back home. Now, this is their crossing of the Rubicon moment. There's no turning back now. When the people of Boston heard of the returning militia, at least according to Samuel Mather, brother of Increase Mather, this secret cabal, very much focused around the Mather family, began planning a revolutionary government to pledge support to William and Mary, where Andros had refused. And they did so, according to Samuel, not because of a desire to overthrow an English government, but because they were afraid of this militia, or the militia of many towns, returning en masse and turning into a mob. Now, although this is a first-hand account, there is an awful lot of motivation for Samuel Mather to make this group of family and friends appear concerned for their safety and the safety of English subjects against a mob, rather than what they might actually be, which is a seditious group looking to overthrow an English government with the help of the mob. I'll let you be the judge of that. And in either case, this group of men intended to use the rebel militiamen to their benefit. And Andros was aware of what was going on, and he finally pointed the finger at Cotton Mather, that would be the son of Increase Mather over in England, as the ringleader of this conspiracy. And on April 18th, 1689, was to have him arrested for preaching sedition. But late in the night before, April 17th, the militiamen began trickling back into the general Boston area. In the morning, instead of arresting Cotton Mather, Andros ordered the few regulars he still had at hand to escort these militiamen back to the main frontier. But what he discovered that morning instead is that the militiamen had made their rounds of all the nearby towns and let their story be known. And the local militia, men who were not ordered to the main frontier, then rose up with their fellow colonists. And on April 18th, 1689, they became a mob in the city of Boston, filling the streets, perhaps as strong as 1,000 men. Andros, in his attempt to remove the troublesome young men from their villages over winter, had only given them something to rally around, had given them the opportunity to talk to one another, and created the line in the sand that would force these men to go all in on a very rash decision. Now Andros was facing 1,000 men, formerly under his command. Meanwhile, his English regulars, when he arrived in late 1686, only numbered about 60 individuals. And now these 60 were spread out along the North New England coast, from Massachusetts all the way to the edge of what would now be today the great nation of Canada. Andros doesn't stand a chance. And although we call this group of men in the streets of Boston a mob, they're almost wholly composed of members of the militia, and there are reports that they used signaling devices and drums in order to coordinate their activities. This isn't a mob, but of course the leaders behind all of this, again, are justifying what's going to happen next by saying they were afraid of the mob and would seek to overthrow the Andros government for the sake of everyone's safety and to confirm the allegiance of the colony to the new monarchs. The first thing this so-called mob did, instead of doing things that mobs do, they specifically sought out Captain George of the HMS Rose, the one large gunship that Andros had at his disposal. This so-called mob did this in their first attempt to try to control that ship and prevent Sir Edmund Andros from escaping. Now, there are even some reports that claim that it was the crew, or certain members of the crew, of the HMS Rose itself that arrested Captain George in support of the revolutionaries. Remember, our story has broadened significantly. It's not a question of just the Puritans against the Dominion of New England. The entirety of the realms of England, Ireland, and Scotland, we can include Wales too, although not within the style of the sovereign of the time, were grappling with the issue of who the monarch would be. How far away colonies would be organized is one thing. Who would be king and queen of these kingdoms? What religion would they be? What economic policies would they follow? How would they interact with Parliament? This was a bigger creature altogether, and so it is quite likely that the crew of the HMS Rose, having no deep loyalties with New England colonials, but having heard the same rumors about the ascension of William and Mary, likely arrested their own captain, not wanting to be on the wrong side of history. And yet there were enough crew members to still keep the ship outside of the hands of the revolutionaries, and it remained in the harbor near Fort Hill, where Sir Edmund Andros ran to, guarded only by a handful of regulars. Now this cabal of men, for which we've really only discussed the Mather family's involvement, rushed to seize Sir Edmund Andros's townhouse, which operated as a capital of sorts. It is the home of the executive. It is the White House of the Dominion of New England. And it is at this point we can see the full scope of this group of men, because it's not just the Puritan elite, it's not just the Mather family, it includes prominent businessmen of the Boston area who don't belong to the Congregationalist churches. It includes some of the members of Edmund Andros's own council. In other words, officials of the Dominion of New England. Now, this group in the coming days will call themselves the Council of Safety. Again, truly trying to reinforce this idea that what they're doing reluctantly was a necessity. But again, all of this is happening on the very same day of April 18th. They create a declaration, which it's likely they drafted before this day, and declared from the townhouse to the militiamen in the streets that the Dominion of New England was no more, at least in Massachusetts, where this Council for Safety threw their support behind William and Mary. In their declaration, they say,
"We therefore seize upon the persons of those few ill men which have been next to our sins the grand authors of our miseries, resolving to secure them for what justice orders from His Highness."
They made it very clear that they intended to capture all non-cooperating Dominion officials and send them back to the new monarch for trial. The 15 members of this council write a letter to Sir Edmund Andros to be delivered to Fort Hill, where he and a few regulars were facing off against the swelling mob. The letter claimed that this Council of Safety had no idea that this revolution was going to happen. They had no control over the mob whatsoever. There was no coordination. Nevertheless, for his own safety and the safety of everyone else, Sir Edmund Andros should surrender himself to the council. Andros refuses. Now, the HMS Rose continually tried to get close enough to Fort Hill to rescue Andros and the regulars, putting itself at peril. The mob managed to take control of it, now having its guns trained on the fort. Furthermore, as they closed in, the mob gained control of the cannons at the bottom of Fort Hill and turned them around to face the fort. Finally, Andros agrees to go to his townhouse to meet with this council. He does not call it a surrender, but he is escorted there by the mob nonetheless. A surrender in all but name. Meanwhile, his regulars hold down the fort, refusing to yield. Now being led to his own house, he is surrounded by all of these men he must have considered traitors, members of his own council, as well as enemies he had long suspected of doing exactly what they were now doing. Andros berates them, one by one, telling them exactly what they had done wrong or without honor, accuses them collectively of inciting this mob, which they very likely did. The group responds by dropping the pretense that Andros was in control of any of this, and they arrest him. No longer being civil, the council orders Andros to go to Fort Hill and demand that the regulars there, now numbering about 14, surrender peacefully, because the alternative is perhaps 14 men versus 1,000 who control the artillery on the ground and a warship. It would be a bloodbath. And again, all in support of a revolution in England that no one was certain was successful or not yet at this point. Definitive news had not arrived. Andros, not cooperative up to this point, was well aware of the same problem of optics that this Council for Safety had if their mob does in fact storm a fort and have their way with 14 English regulars. Andros refuses to surrender the fort. He refuses to order the men to surrender the fort. And from this point on, Sir Edmund Andros is not terribly important to the story. The council then turns to the lesser members of the Andros regime, specifically to the aforementioned Edward Randolph, a counselor to Andros, a former customs collector in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the designer of the Dominion of New England. He is the man more than anyone else who is responsible for everything happening in this moment in the city of Boston, and a member of the council puts a gun to his head and is told that you're gonna go down to Fort Hill and tell the men there that Sir Edmund Andros wants them to surrender. Now, Randolph had faced many death threats before, many conflicts, many lawsuits, but with a gun to his head, I wonder if, as many say, his life flashed before his eyes. I heard one scientific explanation for this, where faced with a mortal situation and death imminent, your mind rapidly flashes through its memories, searching for a solution to the current dilemma. I wonder if Randolph thought of all those letters he wrote to the Lords of Trade. Maybe he was regretting the people he selected to compose the government. Maybe as a cousin of the Mason family, he was regretting ever deciding to take on their interests in the New World in the first place that brought him to Massachusetts. Any way you look at it, in this tense moment, Edward Randolph, no stranger to conflict, but not the soldier that Sir Edmund Andros was, agreed. Randolph goes to the fort, and the men surrender. They then put him on a boat, intending for him to do the same for the garrison on Castle Island. The regulars there are immediately suspect of what Randolph is up to. Again, all the regulars in the colony took orders from Sir Edmund Andros directly, and the Castle Island garrison refuses to surrender. But Randolph is a smart man. He goes back and forth with them, and he guarantees them their freedom from imprisonment. In other words, these men aren't believing the lies. They know what's going on. They know Sir Edmund Andros isn't behind any of this. Randolph is told to agree and promise their freedom. The men surrender, and the mob immediately broke these promises and arrested the men. And at the end of the day of April 18th, 1689, Sir Edmund Andros, his regulars, and the loyal members of his council are all imprisoned at Fort Hill. The HMS Rose has its sails taken down to prevent any sort of idea of escaping, and the Council of Safety sends a flurry of letters out in every direction and in every corner of the Dominion, which still exists, except that its head has been neutralized, encouraging the people to rise up against the Dominion government, pledge their allegiance to William and Mary, and perhaps most importantly for our story, resume their former colonial governments, as if the Dominion never happened. By April 20th, the Council of Safety invite another 22 selected men from across Massachusetts society, Puritan and non-Puritan, to join their council and start to create a new government. What's important here is that the Puritans have abandoned the mild theocracy that they had created. This new Massachusetts of their design, they knew would no longer be controlled by the Puritan minority. It wasn't possible. As much as they were now killing the Dominion of New England, they also knew their time of exclusive control was over. At this point, the Council of Safety became an interim government and was led by Simon Bradstreet, former Massachusetts governor and commissioner to the New England Confederation. And he and the others must have had a collective sigh of relief in the waning days of April when they received definitive news that yes, King James II had vacated his throne and William and Mary were now the monarchs. Moving out from Massachusetts, the Plymouth colony restored its government, only having to arrest a single person, Nathaniel Clark, the only Dominion ally that could be found in the colony. For Connecticut, they very quickly resumed their government, and if you listen to the first part of our Dominion series, you'll know that they never actually submitted to the Dominion authority. They hid their charter in a very famous oak tree, and simply never again had a general court while the Dominion reigned. So Connecticut very easily resumed its government. Rhode Island, with the unanimous consent of the voting public, resumed its old government, all of these places adhering to their old charters, whether or not they were considered valid in England. Now moving over into the New York colony, the lieutenant governor of the Dominion of New England, Governor Nicholson, still had control over New York and the Jerseys. The Dominion has not yet fallen, not completely. On the 29th of April, he sends a letter to the Council of Safety demanding the immediate release of Andros and the rest of his officials. The council responds to Governor Nichols that they have no control over what the local militias are doing in the Boston area. Again, we likely know that isn't true. Now, as lieutenant governor of the Dominion, Nichols could not install himself as governor as long as Andros was alive, and he also could not gather enough Dominion councilors around himself to create a quorum. Furthermore, news of hostilities breaking out between the French Empire and the English had made its way to the New World, New Yorkers now had to consider continuing the Dominion government, forming their own government, whatever conflict would come from that, as well as considering the threat of the French to the north on the St. Lawrence, who with their native allies had spent the last decade absolutely destroying the Iroquois, who did not have the powers they had even a decade ago. And Governor Nicholson was going to spend a tense May of 1689 trying to hold everything together. And taking a cue from what happened in Massachusetts, he tries to bind himself closely to the militia captains of New York City. Control the militias, control the colony. Moving back to the Massachusetts colony, on May 20th, the Council for Safety sends word to King William that they were thankful for his takeover. History will come to call this the Glorious Revolution, and for their part, they removed King James's representative in the New World, Sir Edmund Andros. They were following the plan that the Mather family had worked out. King William, we are merely part of your revolution. The Council for Safety then sent out a call for all the towns in Massachusetts to send representatives to meet on May 9th. On that day, 66 people gathered from 44 towns, where they agreed to resume the old government, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for now, has been restored. And likewise with Connecticut and Rhode Island, along with Plymouth, these New England colonies requested that their charters be officially restored in England, or reissued in some fashion. Increase Mather still over there to facilitate that development and continue to paint events in New England as those in the best interests of the new monarchs. And just to be completely comprehensive, the area we call Maine, sometimes a standalone colony, sometimes a possession of Massachusetts, again for reasons of defense, fell back into the Massachusetts fold, and so at this time did the New Hampshire colony. And events moving quickly now. By May 26th, news had reached the New World that William and Mary had been coronated, implying that the Glorious Revolution had pretty much been wrapped up. It was safe to assume that King James II was in exile, or otherwise in no position to believe himself King of England and Scotland any longer. Ireland, a slightly different story. It is perhaps this news that tilted events in New York towards a higher gear. One of the militia captains in New York City, a man by the name of Jacob Leisler, who likely pronounced his name a little bit different than how I'm pronouncing it, created with the other militia captains his own Committee of Safety, and then he was titled the Commander-in-Chief, all under the nose of Governor Nicholson. Today we would call Jacob a German, in terms of where he came from in continental Europe. He and others, similar to the Puritans in New England, saw the Dominion as a papist plot, and now with a war brewing with the French, and the lack of action on Governor Nicholson to repudiate the rule of the Catholic monarch James II and celebrate the coronation of William and Mary, the rumors spread that there would be a massacre of the Dutch inhabitants of New York. Mobs and widespread protests broke out in New York City, and this may not be true, but it is reported that the governor threatened to burn down New York City if the protests continued. This only seemed to confirm the conspiracies and rumors. The guardsmen at the fort on Manhattan Island, Fort James, then allowed the mob to storm and take control of it. This is where Leisler set up his government, and the fort was renamed Fort William after the new king. Poetically anyway, when the Dutch had taken Manhattan Island in 1673 and 74, when Commander Colve took the fort, he renamed it Fort Willem Hendrik. Both King William and the Prince of Orange Willem Hendrik are the same person. And this is the interesting back and forth between different closely related individuals and their separate environs. The Dutch colony of New Netherland was first taken over by King Charles II and given to his brother, the Duke of York. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was briefly taken over again by the Dutch, Prince Willem Hendrik being the stadtholder of the Netherlands. And then by treaty, it was handed back over to the English, still under King Charles II. King Charles dies, and the Duke of York becomes James II, and then Willem Hendrik again, the Dutch nobleman, and yet grandson of King Charles, takes England, Scotland, and Ireland, bites the head right off the snake, and through that, all of the English colonies. And so again, we arrive back at Fort William, although it has been anglicized. Stranger than fiction, Governor Nicholson flees the colony, abandoning not only New York, but truly ending the Dominion of New England. New York for a time will now be split into two camps, roughly divided into downstate and upstate, in today's terms, Leisler will control downstate, but there will be exceptions. Meanwhile, Andros is somehow smuggling correspondence out from Fort Hill. Letters from him are received by Colonel Hamilton of New Jersey and Colonel Smith of Long Island, ordering them both to march to Boston and demand his immediate release. However, assessing the situation, both men wisely decided that they would be going nowhere near Boston. Colonel Hamilton, for his part, witnessed the revolution in New Jersey as almost a non-event. There were no Dominion counselors present in the New Jersey colonies, east or west, in April, May, June, July, August of 1689. And so the people there simply resumed their old forms of government, especially after Governor Nicholson abandoned New York. In August of 1689, Sir Edmund Andros manages to escape the fort, and he makes it all the way to the Rhode Island colony before being captured again. He was under the belief that those keeping him imprisoned were only a very small minority of the elite in Boston among the business and religious classes. If only he could make his way to somewhere in what was now his non-existent dominion, he might be able to find support. He was wrong. And even while he was planning his escape, the new Massachusetts government collected a large amount of grievances against Sir Edmund Andros and sent them to Increase Mather in England, who gained an audience with the new King William. Increase writes back that in speaking with the king, he was pleased to hear of the revolution in the New World, approved of their actions, and it would take all the way until December 1st. But by that point, Massachusetts receives authorization from the king to continue the government they had formed after the fall of the Dominion. This letter also asked for the return of the Dominion officials, however. This would mean that Andros and company would finally get to tell their side of the story. Massachusetts doesn't ship them home until February of 1690, along with representatives detailing the various charges they wished for King William to consider levying against these men. But Andros and company were exonerated on all possible charges, as the representatives sent from Massachusetts could not bring forth a charge that didn't actually coincide with the responsibility that Andros had been given in his commission. In other words, they couldn't demonstrate he abused his power in the slightest. And although the king in April of 1690 dissolves the Dominion of New England officially, Andros is welcomed home, and he will go on to become the governor of the Virginia colony. And if you're keeping score, that means he was governor of what will become 7 of the 13 original colonies, 6 of which he governed at once under this dominion. And the powers he was given, complete executive, legislative, and judicial control, were far greater than the powers given to nearly anyone else in English colonial history, especially over such an expansive land. And then he was actually able to, for a time, exercise that power. Yes, this largely forgotten figure from our history might be one of the most powerful government officials in our history. You might think of prominent generals during the French and Indian War, or the American Revolution, or US presidents perhaps. All of them had limits on their power that Andros does not seem to have had under the Dominion. Governor Nicholson, likewise, will go on to become governor of Nova Scotia, the Virginia colony briefly, and South Carolina. A continuing theme in this season of the podcast, that those who are down and out can find a fresh start for themselves, but almost always at the cost of abandoning that which they knew. Back to the New York colony, while Leisler had the New York City area under his domain, it was the mayor of Albany, Peter Schuyler, who, unwilling to submit to Leisler, maintained a de facto control of the upper Hudson. But after an event known as the Schenectady Massacre, where the French and their native allies attacked a sleepy little settlement on the Mohawk River, guarded by 2 snowmen, the upper portion of the New York colony had no choice but to submit to Leisler. In the attack, about half of the settlement was slaughtered. Men, women, children. Schenectady being my hometown, as horrific as this massacre was, it likely created the conditions of my own existence. Peter Schuyler and others realized that a divided New York colony could not defend itself against the French, and so submitted to Leisler. In all of this confusion, the easternmost extension of the New York colony were the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which used to be their own independent colonies. You can hear our episode on that earlier in this season. They, seeing the chaos in New York, ultimately were advised to submit to the authority of Massachusetts, and to this day, that is where you'll find them. See, I told you the Dominion would be an important thing. Now, in 1691, the new royal governor of New York arrives. Leisler had taken control declaring himself a loyal subject of King William. But the new royal governor discovered that much of the population did not take a good view of Leisler, who had been imprisoning political enemies. And when it came time for Leisler to hand over control to the new royal governor, he did not. A battle ensued. Leisler and his closest followers were taken captive, being forced into a surrender. Subsequently, Leisler was sentenced to be hung, disemboweled, decapitated, and quartered. Luckily for him, he was only hung and decapitated. I know there are a few grammarians out there more upset that I use the word hung instead of hanged in this case, rather than the fact that a man is now dead. And it is a little before this time, a little after this time, that all the new royal governors would show up with new charters. And this radically rewrites New England and firmly ends the early colonial period once and for all. There would no longer be a Massachusetts Bay colony. Instead, there would be the province of Massachusetts Bay, which would have an assembly not selected based on church membership and a royally appointed governor. New Hampshire, given the same treatment and separated from Massachusetts once again for a final time. That's why we have a New Hampshire as one of our 13 original colonies. The many attempts of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to absorb New Hampshire have finally failed, principally because the Massachusetts Bay Colony no longer exists. But the new province of Massachusetts Bay was allowed to keep Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and the area we know as Maine. And we won't see an independent Maine again until the 19th century. And now we move on to the Plymouth colony, which never really had a charter to begin with. They had permission from various English entities like the Council for New England to settle the land, but not form a government. And under the Dominion, the much fabled Mayflower Compact came to an end. And although they tried to resume their own independent government, in the fallout of the Dominion, they were now swallowed up by the new charter of the province of Massachusetts. Goodbye, Plymouth. And just like that, the Puritan oligarchy, which has been so much part of our story this season, both as subjects, but as the power that many people ran from, as we saw in our story on Long Island, Rhode Island, and Providence, and Exeter, that oligarchy was experiencing its last dying breaths. And as these royal governors showed up, they found that New England, without the scourge of the French or their native allies, had ravaged themselves with witch hunts. Today we remember them mostly as the Salem witch trials, but they occurred all over New England. That became consumed in King William's War, a war with the French, where many of the Puritans blamed the Anglicans and the non-Puritans for angering God. The New Englanders would undergo a failed invasion of Canada and would see their frontier beaten back, each colony internally in flux and truly unable to organize a significant response across all of these areas that used to be part of the Dominion of New England. And oddly enough, when the French attacked, or when the New Englanders decided to invade, had they all been united under Sir Edmund Andros, the political map of North America to this day would likely have their lines drawn at angles we today cannot anticipate. But if I haven't already beaten a dead horse on this issue, just as I'm wrapping up this episode, I want to reiterate that the Dominion of New England certainly does set the lines on the map for many of the colonies we hold close to our hearts in the American Revolution. It restores New Hampshire. It destroys an independent Maine. It destroys an independent Plymouth. It moves Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard to the Massachusetts colony. But outside just the movement of borders, the Dominion was an actual experiment in honestly applying the navigation acts to the North American colonies. And it was a massive failure. The English saw this back home, where they would adopt a policy of what we now call salutary neglect, allowing laws that exist on the books to go unfollowed to maintain order and peace. To the benefit of all from this growing grassroots economy centered around transatlantic trade, rather than an over-regulated, top-down designed system such as James II had implemented, which brought economic depression to much of his realms. And on the part of the New Englanders, and those of New York and New Jersey, only around 200 new land grants were issued under the Andros regime, meaning that most of the population simply ignored, rather than resist, ignored Andros in his call to renew land patents and confirm titles. So while England was purposefully neglecting its own custom laws, New Englanders were purposefully learning how to ignore English authority. In the New York colony, colonial politics will be divided into Leislerian and anti-Leislerian parties long after the death of Jacob. And in the wider sense, the Dominion of New England existed in the generation that for the youngest of our founding fathers would likely be their grandparents and great-grandparents. But for the oldest of our founding fathers, a man like Ben Franklin, the Dominion existed within 20 years of his birth and of the adult life of his parents and their peers. It would be blind of us to think that this story of the Dominion doesn't highlight seeds of the future revolution already planted, and perhaps even more directly, a few memories to be passed down only 1 or 2 generations of a time when everything between the Delaware and the tippy top of Maine lived under a government that had taxation without representation. Yes, the historian J. Revel Carr calls the overthrow of the Dominion the first American Revolution, and undeniably at the time, it was certainly advertised as the American theater of the Glorious Revolution. These are all thoughts I'm going to leave you to mull over. Now, there's one part of the Dominion that I have neglected to wrap up, because its story extends a little further than the others. And where our story picks up for the final episode of this season concerns the New Jersey colonies, which partially because of the Dominion remained independent from New York, a colony that had long tried to absorb both East and West New Jersey, and now as 2 separate Jersey colonies that you never hear about. They're going to survive into the 18th century. So please tune in next time for the finale of Season 3 of the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Giannis. Thank you for listening.